The combat that took place on the island of Vu was more intense than the operation on Kiska. It was from Massacre Bay that American troops and supplies were deployed onto the beach. The Allied forces managed to corner the Japanese in Massacre Bay, which was one of the only two areas where they achieved success. The media and public opinion had a notable influence on how the war unfolded in the Northern Pacific due to the secrecy surrounding it and the limited information available. Fast media coverage of conflicts has, over the years, created challenges for the United States, particularly when events like the Vietnam War brought harsh realities into people's homes through nightly newscasts. Many military experts, including former high-ranking officers, studied the possible actions that the United States and its allies could take both before and after the battles began in the desert. During the time when Iraqi forces were retreating from Kuwait, newspapers highlighted the devastation that occurred on the highway of death. While Americans have grown to accept the country's military commitments, this acceptance wasn't always common. The way media covered the combat in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands in 1942 and 1943 is a strong example of how the fog of war, both literal and metaphorical, can obscure understanding. Instead of being covered extensively by many reporters, those events were scarcely reported. Harsh weather added to the confusion, making it hard to see the truth, and with few reporters on the ground, news became filtered, delayed, and often shaped by official statements that avoided revealing sensitive details to the enemy. Speculation and rumors filled the gaps, spreading in newspapers despite being built on uncertain ground. After the battles in Alaska and the Aleutians, the war continued, but Americans had limited knowledge of what really happened during the only fighting to occur on U.S. soil. The news that did reach the public was often incomplete. On June 4, 1942, the New York Times featured a concerning headline, "Coast Radio Silenced." The 4th Army Fighter Command in San Francisco had ordered all radio transmissions to stop, fearing they might help guide unidentified aircraft, which later turned out to be friendly. At the same time, a major battle was taking place at Midway, over 1,000 miles west of Hawaii, and another Japanese attack was happening north of that island. Though the Americans saw these operations as a major offensive push by Japan, some newspapers treated them as unrelated events. One such operation was a daylight raid on Dutch Harbor in Alaska. The Navy issued a short statement saying there were no further details. Despite being preoccupied with news from Midway, the San Francisco Chronicle still noted the Dutch Harbor attack and warned that the war was drawing nearer to the U.S. mainland. The attack, however, was downplayed as less shocking than described. Hanson Baldwin of the New York Times suggested that the actions in Alaska and Midway were not unexpected, viewing them as retaliation for the April air raid on Tokyo launched by Jimmy Doolittle from the USS Hornet. In Baldwin's opinion, Dutch Harbor was merely a preliminary move. The next day, news of the American victory at Midway was published, and the Navy denied any additional operation at Dutch Harbor. A new radio blackout was reported on the West Coast, and the Dutch Harbor attack prompted Seattle to go into full war mode. Some in the press speculated that the attack on Dutch Harbor was meant to distract U.S. forces from Midway. With no Navy press releases and no reporters in the remote Alaskan region, many West Coast residents feared they would be next. One of the most sensational stories emerged in both the San Francisco Chronicle and the Chicago Tribune, originally published by the Tribune. The report claimed that the U.S. Navy had known about Japan's plans in advance and was preparing for the arrival of their main force at Midway. American forces had ignored Dutch Harbor, focusing instead on Midway, where they expected the main assault. To avoid revealing that U.S. codebreakers had deciphered Japanese naval communications, Navy officials had to keep quiet, though many of them believed the story should not have been printed. Due to the lack of reporters and the Navy's intense secrecy, the news from the Aleutians remained vague. Army and Navy press releases formed the bulk of information shared with the public. These releases were then circulated across the country through wire services, meaning that everyone received the same news regardless of their location or media access. Sometimes broadcasts from enemy sources were picked up by these wire services. Though most Americans dismissed them as propaganda, they occasionally turned out to be true. On June 9th, a Berlin radio broadcast reported that Japanese forces had captured islands in the western Aleutians. Japan later confirmed this, but the U.S. Navy denied it, stating that no inhabited islands were under foreign control. Japan, however, insisted that the Midway campaign had stopped the U.S. from reinforcing Alaska and claimed that the Dutch harbor raid had destroyed American bases that threatened Japanese interests. The press warned of the possibility that Japanese forces could hide within the dense Aleutian fog and potentially launch future attacks on Russia. It was assumed that each inhabited island in the chain had defenses. On June 13th, the Navy confirmed Japanese landings on Attu and Kiska, noting that weather had delayed confirmation. Japanese troops had positioned themselves on Attu, and ships were anchored in Kiska's harbor. The next day, headlines warned of a shroud of silence over the fighting in the Aleutians. The Army reported that its planes were trying to drive the enemy from their positions, and fears grew that this was a foothold for future mainland attacks. Alaska's congressional delegation urged vigilance, and the Navy described the landing as an attempt by Japan to save face. Despite this, the Navy was not idle. Reports indicated that 3 Japanese cruisers and 6 other warships had been damaged in air attacks. Some described the fighting as a smaller version of the Midway victory, while noting that the general situation in the Aleutians remained unchanged. Secretary of War Henry Stimson downplayed the threat, telling reporters that the enemy held only a small force in one of the cloudiest regions on Earth. He asked for patience and understanding, as communication under such conditions was extremely difficult. Japan took pleasure in destroying oil tanks at Dutch Harbor, having missed the opportunity to do the same at Pearl Harbor. On June 20th, the Navy stated that hostile forces would be dealt with once the fog lifted. The mystery surrounding the Aleutian battles, one writer noted, was really a combination of bad weather, limited visibility, and the need to keep the enemy uninformed. Many on the West Coast still believed the risk of Japanese air raids from Aleutian bases was very real. They weren't comforted by Admiral Ernest J. King's comment that he was not surprised by the attacks. If the public was confused about Alaska's situation, he reasoned, then so were the Japanese, and that was a good thing. 10 days later, on June 12th, the U.S. Navy announced the occupation of Kiska and Attu. Lack of detailed information led to further confusion and encouraged speculation by journalists. Some believed Kiska could become a Japanese submarine base close to the Soviet Union's shipping lanes, and if retaken, the U.S. could use it to strike into Japanese waters. Suddenly, these little-known Aleutian Islands received a flood of media attention. Senator David Walsh of Massachusetts, a member of the Naval Affairs Committee, supported the Navy's decision to keep battle details secret. He insisted that making such information public would help the enemy, and that, given the Navy's current challenges and limited resources, Americans should be proud of what had been accomplished so far. Still, by the end of June, the New York Times expressed frustration with the lack of action, as noted in an editorial by Hanson Baldwin. He gave 4 examples to show that it wasn't just bad weather that kept the islands hidden, but also the lack of clear information from officials. He pointed out that none of the islands colonized were ever considered uninhabitable, and then a face-saving explanation followed. He dismissed the idea that the terrain was too rough for the Japanese to make any real use of the area, calling it just another case of too little, too late. During July and August, the Army and Navy gave updates about airstrikes being carried out when possible. On August 1st, the Navy denied rumors that a landing had happened in the Pribilof Islands, but confirmed there were around 10,000 enemy troops in the Aleutians. On August 9th, the Navy reported that Kiska had been shelled by a surface task force, but no details were shared about the outcome. Later, they said cruisers and destroyers had damaged a destroyer and destroyed some ground facilities, and that enough enemy ships in the harbor made the attack worthwhile. There were two main ideas shared in the press. One was that the attack was meant to gather intelligence since fog made aerial reconnaissance difficult. The other was that the Japanese hadn't finished building airfields, so they avoided using ships that could be attacked by American planes. On August 20th, the U.S. Navy announced it had shot down 3 Japanese planes and that a U.S. submarine had sunk a Japanese destroyer or light cruiser. 3 days later, they released numbers of all Japanese ships sunk in Alaska since June. As fall arrived, official updates continued to stress the risks to the Japanese garrison, though they downplayed how bad things really were. The Japanese didn't have enough supplies, and while the U.S. lost the raid on Kiska, the Japanese had taken serious losses. America announced it would strike back. By the end of September, a military outpost was set up on Adak Island near Kiska, and the Japanese were beginning to pull back. Although there was no clear sign of enemy activity in the air, there was still bad news. The U.S. Navy had announced its withdrawal from Attu and Agatu, but a few days later they said new structures on Kiska suggested reinforcements were arriving. There was even talk of a submarine base. A year after the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Chester Nimitz found signs of activity on Attu in late November. Japanese float planes had apparently returned after leaving earlier. The Navy's Pacific commander promised to push the Japanese out. The Japanese garrison on Kiska was said to be stranded due to lack of shipping, but Navy Secretary Frank Knox told the press that only dead Japanese would stay permanently in the Aleutians. The Navy gave more troubling news around New Year's. Float planes were still being used to reinforce Kiska, showing the Japanese weren't giving up without a fight. Their planes attacked American ships and bases. On February 1st, the Navy said surface troops of an unknown kind were engaging the enemy. The use of float planes confirmed there were no proper airstrips. On February 21st, after being shelled by Navy warships, Attu was struck for the first time since August. The Navy said nothing in March, but the Associated Press challenged the float plane theory, stating that an airfield had been built on Kiska a month earlier. At the end of March, the Navy vaguely mentioned a surface battle west of Attu. 4 Japanese destroyers and 4 cruisers had pulled back after facing American forces. The sudden appearance of such a large enemy group made the media wonder if a convoy was on the way to Kiska or if more naval action was coming. No explanation was given, and it was said that details would be shared later when they no longer posed a risk. 2 weeks later, the Navy admitted that development was happening at the Attu and Kiska airfields. A larger fighter strip was being made on Kiska, and a longer bomber strip was being added to Attu. They also said that on March 28th, a convoy had been diverted. Delays continued due to weather, and increased anti-aircraft fire suggested a growing Japanese presence. In early May, March's surface activity reports were released to the public. A reporter on one of the ships gave a first-hand account of the fighting. His article, dated March 26th but delayed, showed that more information was being shared about the Aleutians. The Navy said U.S. forces had landed on Amchitka in January with little resistance. Now, only 70 miles separated Kiska from U.S. aviation bases. Although delayed, more good news arrived. On May 11th, the Navy announced that Attu had been attacked. The battle, fought in dense fog, was highlighted in newspapers when reporters shared stories from the front. Secretary Knox explained the secrecy by saying the U.S. was happy with its progress and would reveal details when ready. The fighting on Attu lasted for a month. Knox said the Japanese had been taken by surprise and that withholding information had been the right call. Daily updates were printed as approved by censors until the island was declared secure. After the March naval battle, the media guessed that Japan might abandon the Aleutians. The Navy had said no resupply efforts had reached Kiska since the last fight. They also mentioned that Kiska's fish-filled streams might help keep the Japanese fed. In July, fog slowed down bombing raids. surface ships pounded the island in preparation for a missile attack on July 7th, but Japanese shore batteries didn't return fire. On July 10th, the Japanese did fire back from the beach. On July 12th, more shelling reportedly damaged 4 Japanese ships, but there was no enemy response after that. Navy reports said attacks continued through July but stopped updating at the end of the month. President Roosevelt later announced that American and Canadian troops landed on Kiska without resistance on August 15th. At the August 22nd Quebec conference, the official report barely mentioned it. A Navy update said the landing team found signs the enemy had fled in the fog, but gave no further information. Kiska was considered inevitable after Attu fell, and bombing had destroyed Japanese communication equipment, so they couldn't tell their Navy about the evacuation. There had been no American activity reports since July 31st, and it was assumed the remote garrison had lost contact with Japan. The last anti-aircraft fire seen was on August 13th during a bombing raid. The size of the landing force was not made public at the time, and the Navy believed evacuation began after Attu's fall. One reporter guessed that the Japanese had escaped in large submarines. Even though aerial photos showed the main camp was being abandoned, it was assumed that Japanese troops were hiding in the hills. At first, landing forces thought they had caught the enemy off guard, but as they moved inland, it became clear the Japanese had already left. Looking back, it was noticed that barges had begun vanishing in July, but it was still doubted that the Japanese could return home using them. Eventually, Japan confirmed their troops had left in July for other missions. The headline read that Kiska had been reoccupied and the Japanese fled without a fight. The public and press believed the fog-covered battle had ended and stopped reporting on it since more urgent events took over the news. On September 1st, New York Times writer Hanson Baldwin gave a final opinion, saying the Attu landing was poorly organized and full of mistakes. He called the strike on Kiska the worst of all, a complete failure of planning and thinking. The fog may have helped hide the evacuation or cover small scout teams landing secretly to check the enemy's strength. The bombings caused some damage but didn't force the Japanese to leave. If they couldn't be resupplied and the situation became hopeless, they simply left. Once again, the Aleutians were hidden in the fog of war, and the story was passed on to historians. Stanley Johnson had made a rude comment about the Japanese control of ATU in Kiska, which made it clear that the Japanese were planning something. After intercepting communications that showed preparations by the Imperial Japanese Navy, Admiral Nimitz, who was based in Pearl Harbor, sent out American naval forces to counter them. Nimitz understood that Japan would likely respond soon to the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, which had occurred in April. The Japanese government shifted its strategic plans in response, hoping the Allies would be forced to accept a defensive position. Japan's earlier goals had been to capture natural resources in the Dutch East Indies, eliminate the risk of Guam and the Philippines becoming U.S. military bases, and maintain control within a protective perimeter of occupied areas. This strategy was designed to establish Japan as the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. However, the Doolittle raid revealed that the inner defense perimeter wasn't as secure as believed, so Japan decided to push the boundary farther east, southeast, and northeast. Their push southeast was mostly stopped at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942. Still, they managed to take Tulagi in the lower Solomon Islands. From there, they advanced to Guadalcanal in June. Midway, located 1,100 miles west of Hawaii, and the Aleutian Islands were also targeted as part of their northeastern expansion. Kiska was meant to anchor the northern end of this outer defense line. The Japanese attack on Dutch Harbor was designed not only to disrupt U.S. and Soviet cooperation, but also to distract Admiral Nimitz from the main strike at Midway, making him unsure where the real attack would happen. Another Japanese group waited between Midway and the Aleutians to attack any American forces moving between the two. Although Nimitz suspected a large attack was coming, By April, he still didn't know where or when. He believed the targets in Alaska were likely Dutch Harbor, Cold Bay, and Mossing Bay. On May 21, 1942, he created Task Force 8 under Rear Admiral Theobald. The fleet included 10 destroyers, heavy cruisers like the Indianapolis and Louisville, and light cruisers such as Honolulu, St. Louis, and Nashville, assigned to patrol the North Pacific. At the same time, codebreakers confirmed Midway would be the main target. Nimitz made the decision to focus there and rightly assumed the Aleutian invasion was a diversion. Still, he warned Theobald that Japan planned to take Kiska and Attu. The Japanese Northern Area Force included 3 destroyers, light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, heavy cruisers Takao and Maya, and 3 more destroyers. Nimitz knew the attack would come after June 1st. On June 3rd, Japanese aircraft attacked Dutch Harbor. Bad weather forced one group to return early, while another group of 12 attacked an airstrip at Otter Bay. The Americans were caught off guard, unable to locate Dutch Harbor in the fog, and lost several planes. U.S. patrol planes had already spotted the Japanese fleet, and American bombers launched attacks, but none hit their targets. Admiral Theobald rushed his fleet to the reported location, but the Japanese had already retreated. The Japanese believed the U.S. had its strongest forces on Adak, Kiska, and Attu. Their plan was to attack Adak from the air before moving on to land at Kiska and Attu. A landing on Adak was considered but dropped due to the American airfield at Otter Bay. Weather also led to canceling the Adak airstrike, even though conditions at Dutch Harbor improved, allowing the Japanese to attack again on June 4th. Meanwhile, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet, decided to postpone landings in the Aleutians and Midway due to the disaster at Midway. The Northern Area Force was ordered to move south to cover the retreat from Midway. That order was soon canceled, and the Aleutian invasion went forward. The Kiska occupation force consisted of light cruisers Kiso and Tama, the auxiliary ship Asaka Maru, and 3 destroyers. They transported 700 Labor Corps workers and 500 Special Naval Landing Force troops. Expecting to face a full American battalion on Kiska, the Japanese found only 10 people at a weather station. The Attu invasion force included 2 transports with 1,200 Army troops and construction workers, 5 destroyers, the light cruiser Abakuma, and the seaplane carrier Kimikawa Maru with 6 float planes. The U.S. learned of the occupation on June 8th, when scheduled weather reports were missed. In the following 2 days, a surveillance plane spotted tents on Attu and 4 enemy ships in Kiska Harbor. After that, the campaign became difficult to track. U.S. forces tried to attack Kiska and Attu for 2 months, but many missions failed due to poor visibility. Though the Japanese briefly left Attu on September 10, 1942, they reorganized and returned in October. Meanwhile, U.S. troops took over Adak on August 30, 1942, and built an airfield to pressure Kiska and Attu. Another unopposed landing occurred at Amchitka on January 9, 1943, and an airfield was also built there. In June, an American plane sank a Japanese transport, forcing the fleet to leave Kiska. This was before Attu was briefly abandoned. As the weather improved at Kiska, the base was expanded. A seaplane tender moved to nearby Agatu Island for operations, but air and sea engagements remained difficult due to the warmer weather. On July 21st, Theobald left Kodiak aboard the Indianapolis, with cruisers from Louisville, Honolulu, St. Louis, and Nashville. The group also included an oiler, 4 destroyer minesweepers, and 5 destroyers. As they approached Kiska through dense fog, they refueled from the oiler Guadalupe. Theobald eventually withdrew after poor visibility made it impossible to engage. When he returned on July 27th, it was decided he would return to Kodiak and cancel the mission. In the fog, 2 destroyer minesweepers collided, and the destroyer Monaghan was also involved in an accident. With 4 damaged ships slowing the task force, they returned more slowly than planned. Rear Admiral William Smith took command of Task Force 8, excluding the damaged ships. On August 3rd, he began his mission. On August 7th, American ships shelled Kiska. Although spotter planes were launched, they were harassed by Japanese Zero float planes and couldn't complete their missions effectively. The shelling caused only limited damage, with 1 enemy ship set on fire and sunk. The raid destroyed 3 flying boats, some barracks, and several barges. American ships suffered minor damage from shore artillery. Only 1 spotter plane survived. The others were destroyed by enemy machine guns. Further bombing had to wait until February 18, 1943, after new ships were available and restrictions on heavier vessels had been lifted near Guadalcanal. There were more Navy surface forces available by that time, but it was a difficult period due to fog, wind, and harsh weather. 4 ships were lost. The submarine S-27 came to a halt on June 19, 1942. Adverse weather conditions caused the destroyer minesweeper Wasmuth to sink on December 29th. 2 days later, the submerged rescue vessel Rescuer was brought back to the surface and left behind. On January 12, 1943, the destroyer Warden grounded and sank. In late March 1943, Rear Admiral C.H. McMorris was aboard the light cruiser Richmond south of the Komandorski Islands and west of Attu. He was accompanied by 4 destroyers, including the refurbished Monaghan and the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City. While moving between Japanese garrisons and the Japanese base in northern Paramushiro, McMorris encountered a heavily protected resupply convoy. This convoy included 2 transports and a freighter, protected by the heavy cruisers Nachi and Maya, the light cruisers Tama and Abukuma, and 5 destroyers. The Japanese cruisers were faster than the American ships and carried more firepower, 28-inch guns against the 10 guns of the Salt Lake City. The Americans had radar, but the Japanese did not. Still, in a daytime battle, visibility wasn't as big a factor. McMorris chose to engage. This decision reflected the different philosophies of naval command. American officers were trained to be aggressive and flexible, while Japanese commanders were more likely to stick strictly to original orders. Despite his disadvantages, the Japanese commander stayed committed to defending the convoy. On the morning of March 26, 1943, the battle began. As Japanese warships approached, they maneuvered to place themselves between the American ships and the convoy. Throughout the engagement, the Japanese ships stayed north of the American column and focused their fire on Salt Lake City, which returned fire. The battle lasted nearly 4 hours. Salt Lake City was hit at least 4 times. The Japanese flagship Nachi took hits early in the fight, and both Japanese heavy cruisers were damaged multiple times. By midday, the fight ended roughly 60 miles west of where it began. Salt Lake City had been disabled and was being towed by Richmond. The Japanese fleet retreated westward, having protected the convoy, but failed to reach Kiska, forcing a return to Japan. The U.S. considered this a victory. Interestingly, this outcome coincided with the damaged ships crossing the international date line on their way home. The Navy in Washington delayed the release of the battle report. A week later, the U.S. 7th Infantry Division landed on Attu to support an amphibious landing. The Navy played a significant role. Rear Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid commanded Task Force 16, which included 2 covering groups, Navy patrol squadrons, submarines, and Army aviation units. The Southern Covering Group included 5 destroyers and the light cruisers Raleigh, Richmond, and Detroit. The Northern Group had 4 destroyers and the heavy cruisers Wichita, San Francisco, and Louisville. Under Rear Admiral F.W. Rockwell, Task Force 51 supported the beach landing. 3 battleships, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Idaho, joined the effort. The escort carrier Nassau brought 26 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters. 8 cruisers provided fire support throughout the month. Once Attu was secured, only Kiska remained. On July 6, 1943, Task Group 16.7 bombarded Kiska for the first time in nearly a year. The Japanese did not return fire. A second, more intense bombardment followed on July 22nd. Among those involved was Marine Colonel James W. Hammond, Jr., a Vietnam veteran and Fleet Marine Force Pacific Plans officer. The main firepower came from the battleships Mississippi and New Mexico, the heavy cruiser Portland, and several destroyers. After the bombardment, Army fighters and bombers struck Japanese positions. One American fighter was lost. When U.S. and Canadian troops landed on Kiska on August 15th, they found no Japanese defenders. The enemy had already evacuated 2 weeks earlier. 15 months earlier, the Japanese had made a similar miscalculation at Attu, expecting Marines and encountering only a weather crew. This time, U.S. intelligence had failed to intercept and interpret Japanese withdrawal messages. The fall of Attu and the failed convoy effort convinced Japanese leadership that holding Kiska was impossible. They began evacuating on May 26th, even before the final battle at Attu. Large I-class submarines had been delivering limited supplies through the blockade and could evacuate about 60 men each. U.S. destroyers and a sub-chaser, likely guided by decoded messages, sank 4 of the 13 submarines, I-9, I-24, I-31, and I-7, near Kiska Harbor. 3 others were damaged or forced to retreat. Only 820 men were evacuated before the effort was halted. The Japanese had to choose between abandoning their forces or risking a surface evacuation. With radar now in wide use, the U.S. Navy could effectively detect any ships trying to reach or leave Kiska. On July 25th, battleships Mississippi and Idaho, heavy cruisers San Francisco and Portland, and several destroyers were stationed southwest of Kiska. Late that night, radar picked up strange blips 15 miles away. The ships went to general quarters and opened fire. Shell splashes created more radar echoes, and the bombardment lasted 30 minutes. No targets were found the next day. It turned out the radar had picked up reflections from nearby islands. More experienced crews aboard other ships did not report any radar sightings. The battle drained the ship's ammunition and fuel supplies. After they left port to refuel, the Japanese took advantage of the situation. Under cover of fog, they sent cruisers and destroyers to evacuate the garrison. 6 destroyers and the light cruisers Tama, Abukuma, and Kiso carried out the mission. Before the final run, they refueled at sea. Despite the fog offering cover, it wasn't without danger. 2 destroyers collided. One returned to Japan, and one stayed with the refueling group.